sun rises over Simpson Harbor like molten brass poured across black water. In the officers' quarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy's South Seas Force Headquarters, Commander Hori Tomitaro stands before a map table, his fingers tracing the scattered islands of the Pacific. The air smells of salt, engine oil, and the faint sweetness of tropical rot. Outside, palm fronds click in the trade winds like the mechanisms of distant clocks, counting down to something none of these men can yet fully comprehend. On the table before Hori lies a leather-bound intelligence dossier, its pages filled with photographs and reports from Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and Guam. The victories had been swift, surgical, overwhelming, but tucked between these triumphant records is a single photograph that holds Hori's attention longer than the others, a grainy image of American Marines during training exercises in California, their faces burned dark by sun, their eyes holding something the Japanese intelligence officers cannot quite classify. Hori traces the edge of this photograph with one finger, and in that gesture is the beginning of a question that will haunt the Imperial command structure for the next 43 months. The Japanese military establishment of 1942 approached the Pacific War with a confidence forged in the furnaces of Manchuria and tempered in the brutal campaigns across China. Their doctrine was built upon the concept of sation, the supremacy of spirit over matter, the belief that willpower and dedication could overcome material disadvantage. Japanese soldiers had marched through Chinese winter with inadequate supplies, had charged machine gun nests with bayonets, had endured starvation rations that would break Western armies. They had won. The Kwantung Army's operations in Manchuria had demonstrated that Japanese troops could subsist on rice balls and pickled radish, could march 30 miles through mountain passes carrying full combat loads, could maintain discipline and combat effectiveness under conditions that European military observers deemed impossible. When Imperial General Headquarters compiled their intelligence assessments on potential American adversaries, this formed their measuring stick. They looked at the American military through the lens of their own experience, and what they saw seemed to confirm their deepest assumptions about Western decadence. The reports compiled by Japanese intelligence in the years before Pearl Harbor painted a picture of American softness that aligned perfectly with imperial ideology. American soldiers, the reports noted, required elaborate supply chains. They expected hot meals, medical care that extended to dental work, rest periods that seemed absurdly generous by Japanese standards. Training films captured by Japanese agents showed American Marines with access to abundant equipment, multiple uniforms, extra boots, personal amenities that Japanese soldiers would consider unthinkable luxuries. One intelligence report from 1941, now preserved in the National Archives, observed with barely concealed contempt that American military facilities included ice cream parlors, movie theaters, and recreation halls. The report's author noted, "The American fighting man has been raised in comfort and expects comfort even in military service. Such troops may be adequate for garrison duty or brief engagements, but cannot be expected to endure prolonged hardship." This assessment was not the product of ignorance. It was the logical conclusion drawn by men who genuinely believed that hardship was the forge in which true warriors were made, and that America's abundance had made its soldiers weak. What the Japanese commanders expected then was an enemy that would break quickly under pressure. They anticipated that American Marines, once cut off from their supply chains, once deprived of their accustomed comforts, once faced with the kind of privation that Japanese soldiers accepted as routine, would lose cohesion and combat effectiveness. This expectation was reinforced by racial theories that permeated Imperial Japanese military culture, theories that positioned the Yamato race as inherently superior in spiritual strength, in tolerance for suffering, in warrior purity. American soldiers, the thinking went, were a mongrel mix, lacking the unified cultural discipline of Japan, softened by democracy's permissiveness, corrupted by material abundance. On paper, this analysis seemed reasonable to men who had only known their own military culture, who had only tested themselves against Chinese forces that were poorly equipped and often poorly led. Then came Guadalcanal. August 7, 1942. the first American offensive of the Pacific War. When the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on that malaria-haunted island, Japanese commanders viewed it as an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate American weakness, to crush this counteroffensive and resume the southward advance toward Australia. The initial intelligence reports from Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, commanding the 1st Japanese force sent to retake the island, reflected confidence bordering on arrogance. Ichiki had led troops in China and knew what Japanese infantry could accomplish through aggressive night attacks and superior spirit. His force of 900 men, he believed, would be more than adequate to drive the Americans back into the sea. He sent a message to his superiors: "The enemy's fighting power is surprisingly weak. The attack is going exceptionally smoothly." That message was sent on August 20th. By dawn on August 21st, Ichiki's force had been virtually annihilated at the Tanari River, caught in a U.S. Marine crossfire that killed all but a handful of the 900 attackers. Ichiki himself, wounded and facing the destruction of his command, committed suicide on the battlefield. The Marines had not retreated. They had not broken under night attack. They had maintained fire discipline, held their positions, and then counterattacked with tanks and light artillery, systematically destroying the Japanese force. Japanese commanders receiving these reports faced their first cognitive dissonance. The reality did not match the intelligence assessments, did not align with their fundamental assumptions about Western character. But isolated defeats could be explained away. Perhaps Ichiki had been overconfident, had made tactical errors, had underestimated local American strength. Imperial General Headquarters sent the Sendai Division, a veteran formation with a distinguished combat record, to complete the mission. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, commanding the operation, was more cautious than Ichiki, more methodical. He studied the intelligence reports, planned a coordinated assault from multiple directions, and launched his attack in mid-September with forces that outnumbered the Marines in the target sector. What happened on what would become known as Edson's Ridge shattered another layer of Japanese assumptions. For 2 nights, Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion held a critical ridgeline against repeated Japanese assaults. They fought through darkness and rain, through artillery bombardment and close-quarters combat. They held without relief, without reinforcement, using captured Japanese ammunition when their own ran low. When dawn came on September 14th, the ridge was still in Marine hands, and the jungle slopes were carpeted with Japanese dead.
Kawaguchi's after-action report, captured after the war, reveals something extraordinary, a fundamental reassessment beginning to take shape. He wrote, "The enemy's determination was unexpected. Their defense was not that of men fighting for orders, but of men fighting for something they believed in. Even wounded, they continued to resist. Their discipline under fire exceeded our intelligence estimates by a significant margin." This was a crack in the edifice of imperial confidence, the first admission that something in the Japanese understanding of their enemy was fundamentally flawed. As the Guadalcanal campaign ground on through September, October, November, 6 months of savage jungle warfare, Japanese officers on the island began sending reports that increasingly contradicted everything Tokyo had been told about American fighting men. The Marines were not collapsing when cut off from supply. They were digging in, adapting, learning. They maintained unit cohesion under conditions that should have shattered morale. Most troubling to Japanese commanders, the Marines were improving, learning jungle warfare techniques, adapting to night combat, becoming more effective as the campaign progressed rather than degrading as expected. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding Japanese naval forces in the Solomons, wrote in his personal diary, "We face an enemy different from our expectations. Where we anticipated softness, we find determination. Where we expected confusion, we encounter systematic organization. Our intelligence has failed us." But it was not merely that American Marines fought harder than expected. It was the nature of how they fought that began to unsettle Japanese military thinking. Traditional samurai philosophy, deeply embedded in imperial military culture, emphasized individual warrior spirit, aggressive action, the willingness to die rather than accept dishonor. Japanese night attacks relied on this ethos, sudden, violent assault, accepting heavy casualties to achieve breakthrough, maintaining attack momentum through sheer will. The Marines fought differently. They fought with a systematic approach that combined individual initiative with coordinated fire support, that valued the objective over theatrical courage, that was willing to retreat tactically and counterattack methodically. This was not the fighting style of men who lacked warrior spirit. It was the fighting style of men who approached warfare as a professional problem to be solved rather than a test of spiritual purity. The symbolic object that recurs in Japanese reports with increasing frequency is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, it is food. On Guadalcanal, as Japanese forces slowly starved, cut off from resupply by American air and naval superiority, officers reported with bewildered anger that captured Marine positions contained stocks of supplies that seemed impossible. Canned meat, chocolate, coffee, medical supplies in abundance. One Japanese lieutenant captured in November 1942 told his interrogators, "We found supplies in the American positions that we could not believe, food we had not tasted in months, medicine for diseases that were killing our men. We began to understand that we were not fighting an enemy that was weaker than us. We were fighting an enemy that came from a world we did not understand, a world where such abundance was normal, taken for granted." This observation cuts to the heart of the cognitive disconnect. To Japanese soldiers, the American logistical system was seen not as a manifestation of industrial strength, it was seen as almost incomprehensible waste. And yet this waste sustained fighting men who showed no signs of the weakness that such abundance should have produced. As 1942 turned to 1943 and the island campaigns moved up the Solomon's chain, Japanese assessments of U.S. Marines underwent a reluctant transformation. Intelligence reports began to categorize Marines as elite troops, comparable to Japan's own Special Naval Landing Forces. But this categorization itself was a defensive mechanism, a way to preserve the broader assumption about American weakness. If Marines were elite troops, specially selected and trained, then their effectiveness did not necessarily contradict beliefs about the general American character. This rationalization would not survive contact with reality. At Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese commanders prepared a defense they believed was impregnable, fortified positions built from coral and concrete, overlapping fields of fire, 4,500 defenders committed to fighting to the death. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commanding the Tarawa garrison, famously declared, "1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years." The Marine assault on Tarawa was indeed costly, 1,000 Marines killed in 76 hours, but the island fell. Japanese defenses that should have held indefinitely were systematically reduced by Marine tactics that combined firepower, engineering, and relentless infantry assault. What disturbed Japanese commanders analyzing the Tarawa battle was not simply that Marines had overcome fortified positions, it was that they had done so with a grinding determination that contradicted every assumption about American unwillingness to accept casualties. Imperial military doctrine held that democracies, dependent on popular support, could not sustain wars of attrition, could not accept casualty rates that would be politically devastating at home. Tarawa should have broken American will. Instead, it seemed to harden American resolve. Post-war interrogations of senior Japanese officers reveal a recurring theme, the puzzled observation that American society did not respond to battlefield losses the way Japanese military theorists had predicted. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who would later command the defense of Iwo Jima, wrote to his wife in 1944, "The Americans are not what we were told. They mourn their dead, but they do not stop fighting.
Their democracy does not make them weak. It seems to make them more determined. I do not understand this, but I see it clearly."
By 1944, Japanese intelligence assessments had undergone a quiet revolution. Reports on U.S. Marine Corps capabilities no longer dismissed them as soft or weak. Instead, they cataloged strengths with clinical precision, superior coordination between ground and air forces, effective integration of armor and infantry, rapid adaptation to different terrain, psychological resilience under sustained combat. A Japanese Navy intelligence report from March 1944, analyzing the Marine landing at Bougainville, concluded, "Enemy Marines demonstrate combat effectiveness that equals or exceeds our special naval landing forces across all operational parameters. Their logistical system allows sustained operations that our forces cannot match. Recommendation: do not assume American forces will withdraw or lose cohesion when isolated. They will defend until relieved or until all combat-effective personnel are casualties." This transformation in understanding was most clearly articulated in the defensive planning for the inner ring of Japanese defenses, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the home islands themselves. Kuribayashi, preparing Iwo Jima's defenses, explicitly rejected the traditional Japanese tactical doctrine of immediate counterattack and banzai charges. He had studied Marine tactics carefully, had read translated Marine Corps manuals captured in earlier campaigns, and he understood that Marines were trained to use Japanese aggression against them, to channel banzai charges into killing zones and annihilate them with massed fire. Kuribayashi's defensive plan for Iwo Jima was built on a fundamentally different assessment of his enemy. He wrote in his operational orders, "The enemy we face is not inferior in fighting spirit. They are well-trained, well-equipped, and they will not break under conditions that would shatter lesser forces. Our only path to effectiveness is to force them into slow, costly fighting for every position." This was a complete inversion of the confidence with which Japanese commanders had approached combat with American forces in 1942. The battle for Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 became a test case for this evolved understanding. Kuribayashi's forces fought from prepared positions, avoided wasteful banzai charges, forced Marines into brutal cave-to-cave, bunker-to-bunker combat. It took 36 days and cost the Marines 7,000 killed and 19,000 wounded, the only Marine battle in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese. Yet even this defensive masterpiece ended in defeat. Every one of Kuribayashi's 21,000 defenders died or was captured. The island fell. What the battle demonstrated to Japanese commanders was not that their new understanding of Marines was wrong. It was that even a perfect defensive battle, fought by determined troops against an enemy whose strengths were fully acknowledged, could only delay the inevitable. In the final months of the war, Japanese documents reveal a military leadership that had moved from contempt to respect to something approaching fatalistic admiration. A Japanese army analysis from June 1945, discussing the Okinawa campaign that had just concluded with another catastrophic Japanese defeat, observed, "The American Marine, supported by overwhelming material superiority, nevertheless demonstrates individual fighting qualities that cannot be explained by material advantage alone. He fights for concepts, democracy, freedom, home, that we dismissed as weaknesses. We now understand these concepts do not make him weak, they make him formidable, because he believes he is fighting not just to obey orders, but to protect something valuable. This is a different kind of strength than we anticipated." What the Japanese commanders had discovered at terrible cost was that their fundamental premise was inverted. They had believed that hardship created strong soldiers and abundance created weak ones. What they learned was that abundance, material, political, spiritual, could produce soldiers who fought with determination precisely because they had something worth preserving.
The American Marine was dangerous not despite coming from a society of plenty, but because of it. He had experienced freedom and prosperity, and he was willing to fight savagely to defend those conditions. The ice cream and the movie theaters and the comfortable barracks were not signs of an army that would crumble under pressure. They were signs of a society that could support its fighting men comprehensively, that valued them enough to provide not just weapons, but welfare. And this comprehensive support translated into battlefield effectiveness that Japanese commanders had not imagined possible. The symbolic power of American food abundance became, in the closing months of the war, a kind of psychological warfare in itself. On Okinawa, starving Japanese soldiers would sometimes infiltrate Marine positions, not to attack, but to steal food. Post-war interviews with Japanese survivors described the demoralization that came not from battlefield defeat alone, but from the daily recognition of the material chasm between the two sides. American forces eating hot meals, while Japanese forces scraped through caves looking for roots to boil. American Marines supplied with clean water, while Japanese soldiers drank from contaminated streams and died of dysentery. One former Japanese soldier, interviewed decades after the war, said, "We were taught we were superior because we could endure what others could not. But on Okinawa, we learned that there are different kinds of strength. The Marines could fight just as hard as we could, but they did not have to choose between fighting and eating. They could do both. That was when I understood we would lose."
The transformation in Japanese military thinking about U.S. Marines from dismissive contempt to hard-won respect mirrors a larger transformation in how the imperial command structure came to understand America itself. In the beginning, they saw American democracy as weakness, the inefficiency of divided government, the indiscipline of free speech, the distraction of material comfort. By war's end, they had learned that democracy was not weakness, but a different kind of strength, one that could mobilize industrial power, sustain political will through years of grinding warfare, and produce individual soldiers who fought with both discipline and initiative. The Japanese military establishment had built its worldview on the idea that only through renunciation and suffering could true strength be forged. The Marines demonstrated that men who came from abundance and freedom could match that strength and exceed it, because they fought not from indoctrination, but from conviction. As the sun sets over Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur accepts Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Among the Japanese delegation standing on the deck is Mamoru Shigemitsu, limping on his wooden leg, his face carefully neutral. Somewhere in the formation of Marines standing guard on that deck is a young corporal who landed on Guadalcanal in 1942, who fought through Tarawa and Saipan and Okinawa, who carries on his rifle the scratched names of a dozen islands. He does not know that in archives in Tokyo there are intelligence reports that chart the journey of how Japanese commanders came to understand him, reports that begin with contempt and end with reluctant acknowledgement of a fighting man whose strength came not from deprivation but from a society that valued its citizens enough to feed them, equip them, and trust them to fight not because they were ordered to die, but because they chose to defend something worth living for. The truth about what Japanese commanders thought of U.S. Marines is not a single assessment, but a painful education, purchased with blood across 1,000 miles of Pacific islands. They learned, too late to change the war's outcome, that the ice cream and the coffee and the abundance they had mistaken for weakness were the products of a system that could afford to care for its fighting men because it had the industrial strength and political will to wage total war. They learned that democracy did not make soldiers weak, it made them dangerous, because free men fighting to preserve freedom bring to battle a determination that cannot be created through indoctrination or ritual.
They learned that American Marines were not soft, not undisciplined, not easily broken, but were instead exactly what a powerful, prosperous democracy produces when it goes to war: professional, adaptable, relentless, and ultimately victorious. In the end, the Japanese military's journey from contempt to respect is a parable about the danger of mistaking different strengths for weakness, about the cost of ideology that blinds you to reality, about the power of a system that treats its defenders as valued citizens rather than expendable tools. The Marines taught that lesson battle by battle, island by island, until the lesson could no longer be ignored. And on that September morning in Tokyo Bay, as surrender documents are signed and the war finally ends, that lesson is written in the silent respect of defeated commanders who had learned too late that they had always misunderstood their enemy, and that this misunderstanding had doomed them from the start.